Hello, good evening and welcome. My name is Joshua Brumberg. I'm the Dean for the Sciences here at the Graduate Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our City of Science event tonight. Tonight's event is entitled How We Learn Language from Birth Through Adulthood. As a parent, I was amazed how quickly my children learned to talk, and as a former foreign language student, I know firsthand how frustrating it can be learning a language later in life. This evening, our panel will enlighten us on these and other issues central to language development and its centrality to the human experience. The Graduate Center, as our name implies, is a national leader in graduate education, including the sciences at the master's and especially the doctoral level. Before touching on tonight's event, as many of you know, the Graduate Center is the home of innovative research and creative works of Nobel, Guggenheim, and Pulitzer winners. We have one of the largest PhD granting institutions in the country, and we are especially proud to rank among the country's top institutions in awarding doctorates to students from underrepresented groups. I am confident in saying that no other graduate school in the country takes more seriously its public responsibilities to its missions to advance knowledge for the public good. The Graduate Center is not just a place dedicated to advance education and research. It is also a laboratory of ideas, which delivers the finest research and scholarships to and far beyond the 5 boroughs. Each year, our doctoral students teach more than 100,000 undergraduates at the City University of New York, bringing the very best research and learning from the seminar room into the classroom. We're also an incubator of scientific ideas reflected in our academic programs, in our free public events, such as what you will witness tonight. I hope you will make a habit of attending our public programs, lectures, and events, which will allow you truly to be part of the City of Science. While many species communicate through vocalizations or other signals, I would contend that none of them have as complex a form of communication as human language. The richness and variety of languages that exist is truly amazing, and with some estimates suggesting that there are over 7,000 languages being spoken today. Absent the babblefish from the Hitchhiker's Guide, how do we learn these languages, and why does it matter when we start learning them? To address these questions and more, I am delighted to introduce tonight's panel. From my left, Dr. Nancy Eng, who is an associate professor in the Department of Speech-Language Pathology and Audiology at Hunter College and a member of our Speech-Language Hearing Sciences doctoral program here at the Graduate Center. Her research focuses on language learning and language loss in bilingual communities, with a special emphasis on the Chinese community. Next to her is Dr. Kyomi Gregory-Martin, who is an associate professor in the Communication Sciences and Disorders program at Pace University, where she studies child language acquisition and currently serves on the board of directors of the National Black Association of Speech-Language Hearing. Rounding out our panel is Dr. Michelle MacRoy Higgins, who is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Speech-Language Pathology and Audiology at Hunter College and a member of our doctoral program here at the Graduate Center. Her research focuses on language disorders and their treatment in children. Finally, serving as moderator of tonight's panel is Dr. Valerie Shafer, who is a professor and executive officer of the Speech-Language Hearing Sciences program here at the Graduate Center. Her research focuses on developmental language disorders and bilingualism. She will lead the group in discussion, leaving time at the end for your questions. So please join me in welcoming our panel and learning a little bit about language as I stumble over mine.
I'm thinking, do we need the microphone? Yes, we need the, is it on? Okay, it's on. Okay, everyone hears me fine. Okay, welcome. And Josh, thanks so much for that wonderful introduction of our panel. You took a few points that I was thinking about saying, but not the babblefish one, but I do appreciate the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I wish I had that fish to put in my ear to help me learn my German. So tonight we're going to have a conversation about this amazing ability we all have, which is language. We often take for granted this skill, and speaking and comprehending, it feels really easy to us when we're working in our first language. We're experts, but our knowledge of how we are so fluent is tacit. It's like, it's really difficult to express. How do we do this? We talk the same way we walk, with great ease, and we can't explain how we do either, right? Can you explain to somebody why you can stand up and walk and your dog can't? Right. So it is only when looking at the young child who is learning language or the older individual after stroke who is trying to regain fluency, or the adult trying to learn that second language, that we recognize how phenomenal it is that we can talk to each other with such seeming ease. So today we're going to have a conversation about this amazing skill. We'll talk about how most children learn language with apparent ease, but there still are a significant number of children who have language learning difficulties. We can also talk about the challenges and rewards of learning and speaking more than one language or more than one dialect. And we're going to talk about how our language changes as we age. So Josh already introduced our panelists, so I think we can get straight into this conversation. And then, of course, later in the program, you'll be able to ask questions of our panelists. So to start off, we'll focus on the little ones, the young, those first years of learning language. Very few of us probably remember what it was like before we could speak, right? So this child goes from incomprehensible babbling, right? You've all seen your children babble or your nieces and nephews babble, and we go from that. And before you know it, you have this 4-year-old who has highly sophisticated questions and is asking you embarrassing questions sometimes, and because they have such sophisticated language. This is effortless for maybe 10 to 15% of the population. But we have occasionally these disabilities, and some of you have seen this with children who have some sort of learning disability or have autism. So my first question that I'm going to ask this panel is, what should new parents know about language development during the first few years of life? And what are some of the important milestones of development? And I don't know, Michelle, do you want to take that first question?
Yeah, so I'll get us started. Thank you, Valerie. I think that something that parents should know is that language learning starts immediately after birth, that babies have the ability to listen to our speech, our intonation, our rhythm, and the speech sounds, and they are doing that. And we know that from birth, babies are listening to us and they are figuring out what makes the language that they're exposed to meaningful. So it's important to start talking to your baby immediately and to not stop talking, because we know that a child will acquire the language that they're exposed to. So they go from, as Valerie said, babbling. And so that babbling is really important. Around 6 months of age, babies will start to say ba 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 and ma ma ma, and those are not quite meaningful yet, but those are good practice for saying words. And we see first words around a year. And those first words are things like mama or dada or baby, and those sound a lot like what they've been practicing over the first 6 months.
Kyomi, you might want to add to this.
Yeah, it's so important to think about language and recognize that if you have a child that's not speaking by 12 months, what are some important things you can do as a parent? So sometimes people feel like, oh, let's just wait. We're not really sure what's going on. But you want to really focus on early intervening services, early intervention, and getting services for that child as soon as possible. And there's so many ways that parents can be able to provide language through everyday activities that they're already doing, like cooking, like taking their child to the store. There are always opportunities to have a chance to focus on language.
You want to add to it, Nancy?
Thank you. So I'll just put in a plug for those of you who are thinking about raising children bilingually. So the first question I usually get is, are they confused? Because they're hearing watch and then they hear so well. And what's going on with that? Actually, that's a great way to start building something called cognitive reserve that is getting you to start thinking about input that you're getting. In this case, it would be auditory input. So you're hearing, you're seeing, you're trying to put it all together. It's a wonderful exercise. So if there's one piece of advice I would give is don't refrain from introducing a second language. It's never too early.
So I'll say, so I had an order of questions, but these guys are switching the order. So given that they brought up this question of bilingualism, and we could talk about bidialectalism, why don't we just jump straight into this? Because I know a lot of people worry whether they should be exposing their child to two languages early on, or maybe somebody's just moved to a new country and they don't speak the language of that new country well, and they're worried about, you know, what about their child and learning this second language? Or there's people who just come from a different language background. And this is true all over the world. There's bilingualism, bidialectalism everywhere. Like you go to Switzerland, right? And they speak a Swiss German, and I understand a little German, but Swiss German is really hard to understand. You come here and there's some kids who are raised with an African-American variety of English, and then they have to go in school and they have to learn this more mainstream variety. So I think it'd be good for us to talk a little bit about that. And maybe Kyomi, you want to jump into that?
Yeah, something important to think about is that we all are speakers of a dialect. So let's just start there. If I dropped all of us off at a different part of the United States or to Australia or the UK, it would be very obvious that you weren't from around here, right? Somebody might say, oh, you're not from around here. So when we think about dialect variation, we do not want to denigrate the dialect or language of the home. You know, myself, I have a family who's from Guyana. So I was listening to the dialect variation at home. And when I came to school, it was very different. And as a kid, I kind of became aware, like, hey, wait, they don't say that at school, Mom. You know, you have that awareness. Now, I know some parents do get concerned if they have a child that has a language disorder, but you should continue to use the varieties that you have at home, whether it's a variety of languages or a variety of dialects, and then also get that intervention. What we're concerned about is if there is a disorder within that L1, that first language, okay? But by no means will we tell you to stop speaking the language of the home, because that's still an opportunity for that child to be able to communicate with their grandparents or their extended family. So just having that awareness and just being awareness that we all switch registers. There's words like code meshing. All of us have that as a part of who we are, and that language is culture and culture is language. So it really is a part of our identity and who we are.
So Michelle or Nancy, you want to add to that, or did Kyomi cover all the key points? You think she covered? Okay, we can always come back to these with further questions. So I'm sort of curious too about what the relationship is between developing these language skills and then moving into school and having to learn how to read. And you know, there's some issues there sometimes for children who have language problems. So maybe if one of you wants to comment on that relationship.
So I'll get us started. So learning to read typically takes place in school. We have formal classes, whereas learning language takes place at home in the natural environment. But something to think about in terms of learning to read, that also starts much earlier before you enter kindergarten. So oral language really builds the foundation for learning how to read. So you need vocabulary, you need to know the sentence rules in the language, you need to know the grammatical forms. So all of those skills are learned as children are learning oral language. And another thing that we as parents teach our children about reading is, what do you do with a book? How do you read it? How do you hold it? Do you turn it in a way that the pictures are not upside down? And then we turn the pages, and first we start looking at the left and then we look at the right, and also teaching them that those images, those characters, those letters correspond to sounds. You put those sounds together and they mean words. And by looking at that print, it gives us meaning. So we can teach our very young kids all of these early literacy skills well before they enter kindergarten.
Yeah, and those early literacy skills are so crucial. Something that comes up for me is sometimes parents don't always feel comfortable if they don't speak the English language with using books with their children. You could use any kind of books, but I love wordless storybooks. And it's an opportunity to talk with your child about what's happening in the picture and attach vocabulary to it. So we want to take those opportunities that even if you feel like, I don't feel as comfortable, I don't want to go through reading every page by page, there's still opportunities to talk about language and talk about what's happening in the picture, what the characters are doing, and even getting your child to maybe even retell their own narrative, to tell their own story about what's happening in the book.
And since we're talking about these early development, what are some signs that parents and grandparents should be, and teachers should be looking for that tell them that maybe something isn't quite going right in development?
So there are certain language milestones that we're kind of looking out for. One was mentioned already, babbling. So usually around 6 months of age, that's when we see babies start to babble, but it could be a little earlier and it could be a little later. But by 8 to 9 months of age, if a baby's not doing that, we want to see what's going on. Another milestone was already mentioned, which was first words. And we said, well, around the first birthday, that's when we see the first words. Again, it could be a little sooner or a little later, but we don't want it to be too much later. So 14, 15 months, we really want to see 1 or 2 real words. And then vocabulary grows from there. So around 18 months, a year and a half, babies will combine words together. So something like more milk. And by 2, toddlers should be saying some short sentences. So we can identify some early milestones, really, really early on, 6 months and a year to look for language. So I just mentioned what they're saying. I didn't say anything about what they're listening to. So I'll pass. Let someone else talk about that.
Yeah, so we want to think about all of the language input that our children are getting. I think something that's really important to think about is some people might be saying, well, I think something's off. Now, what do I do, right? There are many ways to get referrals, especially with birth to 3. You can think about going to the pediatrician, you can contact early intervention services. But I think the most important thing is to do something about it early on. There's also resources like the clinics at speech pathology clinics. You can go that route as well. I know this has been a challenging time with the pandemic. As the aftermath of it, a lot of children have some gaps. And people are noticing, well, my child's not really saying anything. So I think the time is now, if you notice something, to do something about it.
And I'll just add one other feature to look at. So we've been talking about language, what we're producing, what we're saying. We're talking a little bit about comprehension. How much does your child understand? What I've been seeing in practice, however, is the parent who comes in and says, there's something off, but I don't know what. And a lot of times the I don't know what is the other piece of language that we really haven't spoken about today. And that's communication. So you may not have wonderful language skills. I don't have a big vocabulary, but am I able to communicate? Can your child point to that thing that I want? And mommy, look, that's what I want. Do we see all those attempts to communicate? And I'm beginning to realize lots of folks are coming in. They can't really articulate what the issue is, but they do see it's the communication piece that's lacking. So you want to pay attention to that.
And I think often when that piece is missing, that might be where the kid might be on the autism spectrum, right? When they're not communicating. And I don't know if people want to say anything about autism, because a lot of people hear this in the news, and what should you be looking for?
It's interesting about autism because I think because it's sort of a buzzword, that's the first thing people think of when they think about their child maybe having an issue with communication. In terms of like social skills, you might see the child doing stimming and doing, putting things in a certain order. There are a whole bunch of different signs around ASD. But the most important thing is that I've had children that have been on my caseload. If they suspect ASD, sometimes they put them on the caseload of the SLP, and they'll see them for a period of time before they eventually, they go in and get tested to see if they have that diagnosis. And sometimes that might make the difference in that time to really see exactly what's happening with that child's language skills and to really know, is it a language delay or is it, truly autism?
Something that you mentioned about language delay versus autism is important. I think that autism has a lot of hype and people seem very familiar with that word. And it seems like there's a lot of individuals that are diagnosed with autism. I think the latest statistic is 1 in 74 kids are diagnosed with autism, and that's a lot, but 1 in 15 kids are late talkers or show a language delay. So early language delay is really much more common than autism. And sometimes we don't know what's going on exactly early on. So the idea is anytime there is any sort of language delay, we definitely want to help that family, help that child, figure out what's going on to get them some help.
So we've been covering these early years, and what about those middle years when the children are in school, like elementary school, junior high, senior high? What's going on with their language during those years?
So much input. When you think about the academic environment and how much information students have to retain, auditorily presented information, written information. And sometimes what often happens is that second to third grade sort of period is where, they go from learning to read, to reading to learn. And that's oftentimes people will catch, say, well, what's going on? They're sitting a test or they're not quite understanding what's happening. So there's a lot happening during that time. And there are all kinds of different things that could be going on. It could be ADHD, it could be a central auditory processing disorder where the child is receiving information, they're just having challenges with being able to process all the information and remember it. So there are a variety of different things. There's dyslexia. So it could be an issue with letters and reading. So there are a lot of things that if you notice, something that is off, or maybe even that child notices something that you can get intervention for.
And I was just watching a TED talk of a high school student with dyslexia who was talking about the cost of getting treatment. She totaled up to $400,000. And then there were some real issues too with who gets the intervention. And I think it's something we need to be aware of, that we have to support our public schools having the resources to intervene. We could go off into politics now, but I guess maybe we'll stay off that topic. So again, we can come back to talking more about these middle years too. I think at some point we'll come back to this question of, well, actually, there is maybe one more question, right? So this is the child who's entering school who has a different variety of language, right? And now they have to learn to read, they have to learn to write, they have to learn to use this mainstream language. And I think, Kyomi, this is sort of a topic maybe you can talk about a little bit. I know second language learners have to do this as well, but it's clearer when you have somebody who's just moved here from China and they have to learn English and they only know Mandarin. But what about the child who's coming in and they just have a different variety? And what should the teachers be aware of?
Well, I think we need to be aware of what that dialect variation looks like to be able to know what it is. But there's actually been a lot of talk about linguistic justice. I don't know if you've heard that term. Around this idea of really not denigrating the home dialect or language the child speaks. Obviously, within the school system, there is an idea that you're learning the mainstream, right? Because of the material that's being provided to you in the curriculum. But there's also this awareness that we have to, as at least teachers and as SLPs, focus on not denigrating that home language, maybe just explaining to the child that these are differences between these dialects, but it doesn't make one better than the other.
Okay, thanks. And I'm very interested in that topic now too, so I'm
Yeah,
learning more.
it's a really good book, Linguistic Justice.
Yes,
Yeah, by
yes.
April Baker Bell.
Yes. So, so why don't we switch just to the other end of the spectrum, language and aging, right? So, so many of us, as we move up older into life, we start noticing that we can't find a word, you know, it's on the tip of the tongue. Our parents start having different types of cognitive decline, and we start worrying about ourselves as well. So what happens with healthy aging, right? What should we expect just with our language as we get older? And I guess then the other question is, and what should we worry about? And what can we do, I guess, to keep our language healthy? So Nancy wants to answer that question. I know she does.
Sure. So I want to make sure that I hit all my points, and if I don't, please put a hand up and ask me. So the good news is that not everything goes downhill, Valerie. So that's the good news, right? So there are aspects of language that's associated with healthy aging that really doesn't change. So comprehension, for example, by and large stays pretty much intact. We can talk about comprehension of complex utterances. That's something different, right? So passive sentences like the dog was chased by the cat. That's going to be a little more difficult to parse. But in general, comprehension seems to stay intact. Vocabulary and word knowledge stays intact. Vocabulary is the words that you know. The knowledge is the knowledge you associate with the word, like table we know is a piece of furniture, it's a noun. So it's all that knowledge that seems to stay intact. What else stays intact is your ability to judge grammar. That is, if you hear something off, you know it's off. So that skill seems to be very much intact. So that's the good news. So the flip side of that is, so what does change? So I think, Valerie, as you alluded to, word finding, absolutely, that takes a bit of a dive, right? So many folks might complain about, gee, I know what I want to say. It's an animal, it's in Australia, it's got a pouch. I can't remember what it's called. So that tip of the tongue feel, that's exactly what it is. I know the meaning, I know the content, but I can't get the sounds to come out in the order they're supposed to come out, right? Because if I reverse the letters around, I reverse the sounds, I get something else, right? Pat becomes tap, and it's now all wrong. So tips of the tongue are concerns as we age, and we do get those more often. We get more slips of the tongue. I think Bush Sr. at one point said, I don't want to ruin this lovely recession, when he was at a reception, right? So these sort of slips of the tongue things become more and more intrusive, and we start to notice those.
Yeah, I keep calling my brother, my son, my brother, my husband, yeah.
That might be a different
No,
conversation.
those are names. No, my mother used to go through all our names when we were kids as she got older, including the cat's name.
Oh, no, I do that with my twins, but I
Yeah,
guess
yeah.
that's okay because they're
Yeah,
twins.
Yeah, but then we catch ourselves sometimes, but sometimes we don't. So
Yeah, and there are some words, it's interesting you say that, because there are some words are far more vulnerable. So for example, proper names are very vulnerable. It's really hard to hold on to a proper name. So, but why? Why are proper names so difficult? Because proper names actually don't have a lot of substance. There's not a lot of meat to them. They're pretty shallow. You know that, I don't know, Elvis Presley was this rock star and something about gyration, and then he was dead. That's really all I know about him. So it's kind of hard to hold on to proper names. I mean, we can go on and on about this, but yeah, so those are some of the challenges as we age. You asked me something else.
So, well, even if you can't remember right now, but we could say, well, are there tasks we can do? Or is there anything we can do to make sure that our language and our cognition stays healthy as we're aging?
So that comes up a lot, right? I'm sure all of you who have a smartphone, you get these Lunosity and Perk Tip, and there's a whole bunch of these games that have been developed, and it's really based in neuroscience, where there are games that are targeted at cognitive skills like monitoring. Like, so pay attention to every time I say a word that starts with S. So you've got to monitor for that sound. Or suppression or inhibition tasks, where if I show you a color word, like the word red, but I have it printed in blue, I say to you, what color is the ink? So your answer should be blue, but your inclination is to say red, because it's really hard to suppress reading. If you know the word, reading is automatic. If you know the word, you have to read. So as we get older, our abilities to inhibit starts to decrease. So there's a whole bunch of games out there that are designed based on all these neurocog tests that are out there on the market. I will tell you that the jury's out on that, right? Because some research will say, yes, it absolutely helps. And then others will say, we're not too sure. But I think at the moment, we just don't have enough information.
Yeah, I think it's one of those cases, there's a correlation, but it could just be that people who are healthier are going to do better on these rather than it's helping them. One thing I think that they have found, though, is that exercise is really good for cognition. These are new studies, right? That you know, our brains like oxygen, so staying fit and healthy is good for you. But yeah. So I think there's more support for that. But I agree with you about these language games. They're fun, so do them.
Yeah,
they won't hurt you.
Right. And I'll just a really quick aside, because you were talking about exercise. There's a very, very new study out there. I think it's 2021, where they looked at what kinds of words we lose and what kind of words we retain. And the words that we seem to retain have to do with motion. So words like car, boat, plane is retained better than words that are static words like table and panda. Really interesting. If you're interested, I'll send you the link to it. I was fooling around with this and I found this. I thought it was interesting. I shared with you. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
And
it is
now
interesting.
we'll get back to bilingualism, because there's been some claims that bilingualism or learning a second language late in life somehow protects you from cognitive decline, from language decline, from Alzheimer's, from dementia. So what are your thoughts on that?
So that's, oh gosh, this has got to be now at least 20 years ago when the first studies came out claiming that bilingualism seems to stave off Alzheimer's or any form of dementia by at least 10 to 12 years. There was this big study. This is University of Toronto. And since then, there have been follow-up studies, all of which seems to support this idea that if you are bilingual, because you are bilingual, you're constantly working your cognitive processes. That is, I am bilingual, and I know that my next utterance 不会是讲中文的. I would not come out with something Chinese unless I absolutely forced myself, because it's so odd for me to do that. But as a bilingual, the theory is that both languages are active all the time. And so I have to suppress or inhibit my Chinese so that the English comes out when it's supposed to come out. And that sort of exercise, a lifetime of that type of exercising, appears to support a cognitive reserve. And cognitive reserve has been reported to provide support in the face of neuropathology. So that's the theory.
And I always think all else being equal, I think what it just means is do something, right? Whether
Yes.
it's music,
Yes.
language, crossword puzzles, keep your brain active, and maybe it will help. It certainly won't hurt. I don't know if Kyomi or Michelle have a thought on that. I know you guys focus a little bit more on the other end of the lifespan, but
I have nothing to add.
you're still struggling with the little ones, right? Yes. But we can move to this more general question, right? Because people often ask, you know, is it good to learn a second language early in life, or should you be learning it early in grade school, or is it easier to learn it early in life than later in life? You know, these questions always come up. When is it best to learn a second language? What's the best way to learn a second language? And why should you learn a second language? So we could finish off just talking about this second language learning, since we're talking about this potential benefit of it. We already commented on how it's beneficial. If you are a child growing up in a household, you might want to know your home language because you want to talk to your grandparents. The other end, maybe it sort of protects you, keeps you active. So I'll open it up to you guys. You have any opinions you want to express on learning second language?
Maybe we can go down this way. How's that?
So I think we all will agree that earlier is better, and that there are many benefits, especially to a child whose family speaks a language other than the language of the school, that we know that children should absolutely be exposed to whatever languages are spoken in the home. And I'll speak to kids with language impairment. There was an idea years ago that if a child has language impairment, that they should not be exposed to more than one language. It was confusing, but that has been debunked. And we know that if a child has language impairment, then learning, being exposed to a second language is going to be hard. It's going to be challenging because the first language, that was challenging, but it's very important to continue with all the languages that are important to the child.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you mentioned that myth, because that myth caused a lot of confusion in a lot of households. You might have a parent who, speaks one language, or a grandparent, and then someone else who speaks English in another language. And, you want that child to be able to communicate with whoever is in the household. So I think what I advise is, using the best language models that are possible, regardless of whatever language that you speak, and really having, children do that. Also in agreement, the earlier they learn a language, the better, but it's never too late to learn. So if anybody's thinking about doing it now, I say go ahead and do it. There's so many benefits, as we heard, about your brain being active with learning another language.
So maybe I'll just round this off by giving some examples. So those of you who are thinking, gosh, it's so hard to learn a language. If we just start with words, let's take the word, I don't know, pen. If I learned another language, what am I really learning? I'm learning how to say the word pen in the other language. I don't need to learn that it's the instrument we use for writing. Most of us put it in our right hand. There's ink in it. If you break it, it's all over your clothes. So the only thing you actually have to learn is that string of sounds that attaches to that meaning. So, which I'm just trying to demystify, it's really not that scary. And think about learning that first language. What did you have to do? You had to discover the rules of your first language. And then what did we learn about languages? Well, languages have nouns and verbs, right? We have to talk about objects and we have to talk about actions. Well, all languages do that. So if we approach the task by thinking about what are the commonalities, I think that will make the task a whole lot easier.
And I'll just add to that. I do a lot of studies of second language learning later in life too. And adults actually are quite good at learning a language. What they're not so good at is the production and sometimes perceiving the fine-grained sound. So they have an accent, right? And actually I'll mention on This American Life, they were playing this yesterday on the radio, I think it's with Ira Glass. They had a panel of Chinese Americans who had come here at various ages, and they had people calling in and reading off sentences, and they were guessing at what age they came. And you could guess by the accent, but when it came to the grammar, how fluent they were all highly fluent, even the ones who had come in their 20s, but they had more of an accent, right? So you can still learn a second language as an adult. And sometimes it's useful to have that accent too, because then the people know that there are some little cultural points you don't actually know. And if your accent's too good, they might think you're native, but don't worry about the accent, learn the second language. So I'm not sure how we've got 5 more minutes. So do any of you have a question you want to ask each other that I didn't come up with? Right, because I know that Nancy and Michelle know each other, but Kyomi has just met the two of them. So it might we could even just ask a question, what are you studying now that is related to what we were talking about?
Go ahead.
Well, I'll talk. I'm actually recruiting for a virtual language study right now. It's for children ages 30 months or younger. It's about maximizing outcomes for preschoolers with developmental language disorder. And the goal is that we know oftentimes children who have language delays, they don't always catch up. Even if they receive the intervention, there's still a gap years later. So with this study, we follow the children across over a year, and are able to provide them with services virtually through coaching and working with the parents. And there's we provide some money and also are able to provide the parents with toys. So I've actually put the cards at the front desk. If anybody's interested, those online, you can contact us and I'll get you that information. So that's definitely something of interest.
And Michelle has very similar interests to you.
Yes, so I'm interested in early language development and delays. I'm interested in a population of toddlers who are called late talkers. So these are children who appear to be typically developing except for in the area of language production. So I'm really interested in understanding why 15 to 20%, that's a lot of toddlers fit into this category, and how we can identify those who are most likely to catch up and those who are most likely to continue to need a lot of support. So that's what I'm interested in. And I'm interested in attention in these particular kids. So that's what I have going on now.
Okay, so I have to round it off.
Yes.
And so I've got two projects going on, but I really like to talk about projects where I'm working with Chinese speakers who've had strokes. And specifically, we're very interested in what is it about the grammar of Chinese that we can recruit as a way to prime word retrieval? That is, what is it about the Chinese grammar that I can use as a way to trigger your recall of a word? So we've published a case study on this now, so we're looking to collect more data and involve more clients in this study. So it's a pretty specific topic, but it really isn't if you think about the number of Chinese speakers around the globe. So anybody is interested, you can certainly speak to me after this program. Be happy to discuss the details.
I know we didn't talk too much about stroke and aphasia, but this is another area. We'll have to have another conversation at some point about these different types of brain damage, acquired brain damage. And I know people hear things like Bruce Willis has aphasia, although I think it's a dementia type of aphasia. I couldn't quite ascertain that, but these aphasias, how do we help people who have traumatic brain injury or have a stroke that leads to damage to the cortex, and then they have problems with language. So Nancy does a lot of work on that as well, and a number of colleagues in our program. But I think we need that. We need an entire 2 hours. Separate 2 hours just to talk about questions about acquired brain damage, which of course can happen in the neonatal years and the grade school years and older years as well. So that's another evening we'll have to do on that topic. So should we shift to questions from the audience?
Hi, I'm trying to piece together a couple of comments that I heard. One that was really interesting is this idea of cognitive reserve, and that a bilingual speaker, through suppressing one language in order to kind of communicate in the other, would be enriching somehow their cognitive reserve. And so I'm wondering about thinking of middle school years, a student who might need to, come back into the classroom from the cafeteria and is sort of code switching into, an academic register, those years where students are really trying to become, producers of academic language. How does that sort of code switching, from, one kind of English register to another English register, how does that compare to suppression? And does it similarly, enrich the cognitive reserve? And the last part is like, are those processes tiring or energizing for young minds?
So let me start and you can pick up the academic piece.
Yep.
Okay. So when I talk about cognitive reserve, what we're really talking about is this day in and day out need to inhibit one language, to be flexible. If somebody should put a hand up and ask me something in Chinese, I need to be able to turn that on. So we know from our studies, we know that bilingual speakers are faster at processing speed because of this constant move. We know they're faster or they're better at monitoring. If something changes, I've got to react to that. And so some of these games are based on these sort of processes, these underlying cognitive processes. So if I listen to the question about different variations of English versus bilingual, so it's not the distance of the language pair, that is English versus Chinese or Spanish and French, right? The first two are further apart, the second two are closer. I don't think it has to do with distance, but rather it has to do with the constant need to monitor. And I think the classroom setting could be similar situation.
So when I think about children that are bidialectical or bilingual, I think about them being more metalinguistically aware. They have to be more aware of language. A lot of things that were mentioned. I actually just finished reading The Bilingual Brain, ironically, as you're talking, that's what's coming to mind. And there are a lot of benefits to speaking more than one language or more than one dialect. So I think we just have to consider that.
Yeah, just to add to that, we know there's also like benefits to music, right? So they're showing a lot of the same benefits. So when parents would come and ask me, should my child learn a second language? And I say, if it works for you, but just get them to do something. You might want to put them in a music program or a theater program, or just have them doing something that requires them to be actively using their brain. And so I think that's sort of my view, because we know there's a lot of monolinguals who perform really well on tasks, but they're not, I sort of say the old days, what we'd call being a couch potato, right? Don't just sit on your couch and passively watch TV. And actually, we probably don't even use the term TV anymore. But recently I read something saying that they were showing some of these kids playing video games who are really fast at processing because they were shifting their attention around. So there's nothing to say that playing video games might not be beneficial. I know there might be some issues with video games, but the research is still out on it. And my view is just, if you have kids and yourselves, if you want to stay healthy, just stay active mentally as well as physically. Michelle, you have any point you want to add to that?
Nothing that hasn't already been stated. So
yeah. I think there was a question back here. Oh, here and then back here. Okay.
Sorry, thank you. Hi, thanks for being here. I was wondering, we talked a bit about the feeling that it gets harder to learn a new language the older you are. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about sort of the state of the research on why that is and when that cutoff, if there is one, actually is. I'd love to hear about that a bit.
Sure. So if I say critical period, what I'm really saying is there's a point chronologically at which point the brain becomes less plastic, that is malleable. And we sort of arbitrarily call that the cutoff. And that's around the age of 13. And I don't know what's changed over time. That's sort of that strong argument for difficulties in learning a second language. But we also know there's a sensitive period. And the boundaries there are far more laxed. So we know of folks that can pick up a second language in their second, third, fourth, fifth decades of life. We're not talking about the quality of the pickup, but rather just the can you do it? So that's sort of the quick and dirty answer to your question. But if you want to look at specifically what is it about language that's difficult, I think, as Dr. Shafer alluded to earlier, it's the phonology will always be the biggest challenge, is being able to get that fine-grained piece.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, that's some of the research that I've been doing with my retired colleague Winifred Strange, but some of it is this question about the first language too, just interfering with the second language, right? We're really fast, really good at processing and perceiving our first language. It can be a little noisy and we can still do it. If you guys have ever gone into a noisy situation, like you ought to go out to eat and there's all this noise in the background and you're talking to somebody and you're in your own variety, it's not so hard, but try it with somebody who has a Scottish variety or a New Zealand variety, and all of a sudden you don't know what they're talking about because you're very automatic at expecting certain cues. And you increase the noise a little bit, it becomes hard. For the second language, in your second language, it's really hard to do that, even if you're good in your first language. So the other possibility is just interference. Like the first language, you became so good at your first language, it's interfering with your second language. And I'll say that this is a fascinating question. It's one I'm really interested in, and I really want to know, is there a way we can make late learners better perceivers and better at producing it? And there's lots of training studies where people are trying to do that. My colleague Doug Whalen is sitting here and he's got students in his lab who want to do these training studies and see, can we make people better at production and perception at this level?
I'll add something really quick. We started this conversation talking about how babies, as soon as they're born, they're ready to listen to language and they are really good at it. And what they're doing is they're paying attention to the sounds that are around them. So by the time they're about a year, they've really tuned into the language that they're exposed to. So if you introduce a second language later on, you can certainly learn that, but that kind of explains why it's hard to get the speech sounds and those fine-grained aspects of the language, because from birth, they've been listening to one set of speech sounds. And then you've exposed the child to another set of speech sounds, which might be slightly different. And it takes a lot of practice to really be able to hear those differences in speech sounds and say those differences in speech sounds.
Is there any data that would answer the question of whether an infant that's put into a daycare learns faster or slower than an infant that is raised with just the mother?
So I'm going to give a knee-jerk response to that. And the response is, I think we have to define what you mean by learn. What is it that you're looking for them to learn? So as an infant, we think about different aspects of development. So we are particularly interested in language, but we also want to think about motor development and social development and behavioral. So all of that comes into play. So it's not my avoiding to answering the question. I just want to make sure that we're talking about language.
And I'll just mention just briefly, I saw that this is questions coming up in these child language conferences where in a Danish childcare, I don't know if any of you guys saw this talk where they focus less on language and more on social play. And the kids become very sophisticated with social play, but it looks like certain language skills are behind what other daycares are doing, like in America, where they tend to focus a little bit more on language development and less on that. So as you said, there's these trade-offs. I think Kyomi, you wanted to
Yeah,
add
I
to
was
it.
going to say it really is dependent upon the focus of the daycare, but also I always think about when children are together, there's a forced sort of communication that their parents sort of know what they want. They know if they're pointing to something. So I think I do encourage children that I've worked with in early intervention to have opportunities to be with other children, because there is some level of language interaction that just having an adult with them, they won't get, at least in the spontaneous sense of it, because other kids don't anticipate your needs, but your parent will.
And I'm just thinking also of the last conference I went to with the Australian study where they found that they had recorders in the daycares, and they found that the daycares where the daycare workers were using much more complex language, those kids were progressing faster. So let's put some money in our daycares, right? And this is Yeah, I guess you get what you pay for, right? We have here, and then after that, there's a woman in the middle over here that.
I'm getting back to early childhood education after 35 years and been looking at all sorts of things about child development and all of that. Everything in life is about telling your story or learning how to. If a child was allowed to learn how to tell their own story, which is the foundation of all life, how do you think that might affect the acquisition and understanding of the use of language?
So you're saying a child telling their own story? Can you clarify a little bit more what you mean by a child telling their own story?
Well, it's like who they are, what they like, just to have a chance to express themselves. They don't have to wait for 13 years. Because whoever's story is out there, that's what you think, that's what you know, and everything imprints by the time you're 5 years old, your character.
So you're just talking about giving the child an opportunity to express, communicate and express themselves. So are you talking about just the style of interaction with the child? And when you say tell your own story, I'm just trying to understand what you mean by letting the child tell their own story.
I have a little video. I've been a teaching artist with young kids. So I have a little video on YouTube, like the Emperor's New Clothes, called No Adults Left Behind. And if you saw what they said, they managed to put the basics of life together better than any politician in 30 seconds. My wish for the world would be that everybody should get along together, that people should share, everybody should be friends, people should help each other, and everybody should stop fighting. These are 5-year-old Dominican descent kids, and then they offer adults some encouragement with the title, No Adults Left Behind.
You guys want to comment? I think we certainly agree that we want children to be able to express themselves and be able to communicate.
And I think children can do that without, the younger they are, the less aware of the trappings that we've set for them. We as a society have set for them. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
It's an interesting question.
Hi, I have a question about code switching. So I'm bilingual German-Turkish, for example, and when I talk to my kid, how would that affect the language acquisition of my kid? I mean, first of all, the question is, can my kid speak both languages, German and Turkish? I mean, it depends on input, but also I do mix them on a daily basis, which is normal for multilingual people. But how does or can that affect my kid's language acquisition? Thank you.
I mean, I say use, whatever language input you have. So I actually have a friend who is, her household is trilingual. And she asked me this question because she was concerned. They speak Mandarin, Vietnamese, and English. And she had a lot of concerns about it. But for her household, it worked. I mean, the grandparents only spoke 2 of those languages. She didn't speak the other 2. So it worked for them. What I would say is continue to use whatever the best language models are. That would be my advice. If you're used to switching from one language to the next, go with that. Now, if you find that there are concerns in the L1, the first language, then you should still continue using both languages, but then also get support if you find that your child needs services. So keep doing what you're doing. Don't be afraid. That's what I'm hearing. You can. So you can have a child that learns languages simultaneously. And they're learning at the same time. So that's possible as well.
Well, I would like to thank Michelle, Kyomi, Nancy, and Valerie for a stimulating discussion. Hopefully everyone's understood just the underpinnings of the complexity of language learning and language acquisition. If you enjoy tonight's program, I invite you to attend future City of Science events in the spring and look for those coming in your inbox or your mailbox for the whole GC Presents series for spring 2023. Until then, we wish you a very happy and healthy holiday seasons. Good evening.